There are moments in life when you realize the fight has come to your doorstep. Moments when you either stand your ground or lose everything. This was one of those moments. I stood at my front door, staring into the cold, calculating smirk of a man who thought he had already won. His voice was slow, deliberate, dripping with arrogance. You got 5 minutes to comply or we'll make you leave. His hand moved toward his holster, a subtle, silent threat. But before he could even think about pulling his weapon, my security stepped forward. Rifles raised. Safety off. Ready. Drop it. Carson growled. That smirk? Gone. What happened next? Well, let's just say they left in handcuffs. But to understand how we got here, you need to hear the full story. Because this didn't start with a gunfight. It started with a knock at the door. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. It started like any other day. I was in the middle of work, my laptop open on the kitchen counter, a half-finished cup of coffee growing cold beside me. The house was quiet, peaceful, until it wasn't. Knock, knock, knock. The sound was sharp, deliberate, the kind of knock that doesn't come from a friendly neighbor or a delivery guy. It was the kind of knock that meant trouble. I frowned, setting my coffee down. I wasn't expecting anyone. Instinct told me to ignore it. But the knocking didn't stop. It grew louder, more aggressive. Whoever was on the other side wasn't planning to leave. With a sigh, I crossed the room and pulled open the door. And that's when my stomach tightened. 2 men stood there, tall, broad, and dressed in black tactical vests with HOA stitched in bold, white letters across their chests. They looked like a SWAT team, or at least they wanted to. Both wore mirrored sunglasses that reflected my own confused expression right back at me. The man on the left was lean, sharp cheekbone, with a buzz cut so tight it was practically skin. His posture was rigid, military-like, a clipboard clutched in his gloved hand. The man on the right? Stockier, dark hair slicked back, a thick neck straining against the collar of his vest, and a smile, a slow, creeping smile that never quite reached his eyes, the kind of smile that made your skin crawl. Buzzcut spoke first, his voice flat, clipped cold. Mr. Walker. I kept my face unreadable. Yeah. He didn't blink. We need to talk about some violations on your property. Violations? My brow furrowed. What violations? Dark hair took a step forward, his grin widening. Unregistered renovations. Unauthorized landscaping. Failure to comply with HOA regulations. My chest tightened. I kept my voice even. That's impossible. I'm not part of an HOA. Buzzcut extended the clipboard toward me with the kind of precision that suggested military training. Well, you are now. I took the clipboard from Buzzcut, flipping through the thick stack of papers. Multiple pages. Small, dense print. It was packed with legal jargon, the kind designed to confuse and overwhelm the average person. At the top, my name and address were typed out in bold letters. But there was one glaring problem. My signature wasn't there. Instead, a single line stood out near the bottom, binding under implied consent. I looked up, my grip tightening around the clipboard. I never agreed to this. Dark hair chuckled, the sound low and mocking. You didn't have to. Buzzcut remained stone-faced. Your neighborhood was recently absorbed into a new homeowners association that gives us the authority to enforce compliance. Absorbed? I let the word settle. My neighborhood was miles outside of any city. I had bought this land specifically to avoid dealing with an HOA and their nonsense. There was no way this was legal. I scanned the document again. Fines were already listed. $500 per day for noncompliance. Landscaping violations. Exterior modifications. Trash bins left out too long. And at the bottom, a total amount owed, $155,000. My mouth went dry. Buzzcut's mouth twitched. We're giving you 24 hours to comply or vacate the premises. Dark hair took another step forward, lowering his voice just enough to make it personal. We'd hate for this to get messy. A cold weight settled in my stomach. I met his gaze, my expression hard. This is a scam. Buzzcut didn't flinch. Do you really want to test that theory? I glanced toward the street. A black SUV with tinted windows sat idling at the curb. Through the windshield, I saw two more figures inside, wearing the same black tactical vests. They weren't alone. My pulse quickened. What happens if I don't comply? I asked, my voice low. Buzzcut's lips curled into a thin, ghost-like smile. Then we escalate. Dark hair leaned in. Too close. I could smell the mint on his breath. And trust me, Walker, you don't want that. That was it. I slammed the clipboard back against Buzzcut's chest. Get off my property. Buzzcut took a measured step back, adjusting his sunglasses. We'll be back tomorrow. Dark hair smirked, looking forward to it. I shut the door in their faces, locking the deadbolt. My hands were trembling as I backed away. By the time I reached the window, they were climbing into the SUV. The vehicle pulled away, slowly, deliberately. They wanted me to see them leave. I swallowed hard. Then I grabbed my phone. The first call was to my lawyer. The second, to a man named Carson. I paced the kitchen, phone pressed to my ear. I need to know if it's legal for a homeowners association to annex a neighborhood without consent. My lawyer, Peter Lawson, exhaled sharply on the other end. That depends. Did they file with the county? I glanced out the window. The SUV was gone, but my skin still crawled with unease. They said they did. A pause. Then, if that's true, it's going to be difficult to fight. Proving fraud in cases like this can take months, sometimes years. I gritted my teeth. They're threatening to evict me. Another pause. A heavier one. Walker. If they file with the county, they might actually have the authority to enforce it. I shook my head. No, that wasn't possible. I turned back to my laptop, pulling up the county records. I scrolled, searching. No HOA filings. No new jurisdiction expansions. Nothing that showed my property was part of anything official. They were lying. They're not legitimate HOA officers. I said, pacing the length of my kitchen. Lawson's voice sharpened. Are you sure? I glanced back at the street. Even though the SUV was gone, I knew I was being watched. My gut told me those men were still out there, waiting. Yeah, I muttered. I'm sure. Lawson exhaled. Then they're running a scam. I already knew that, but knowing didn't make it any less dangerous. They'll be back tomorrow, I said. Lawson's voice was grim. Then you want to be ready. I ended the call and dialed again. The line picked up after 2 rings. Carson, I said, my voice steady. Boss, he replied, calm as ever. I need you put the team on standby. A pause. Then his voice hardened. Situation? Fake HOA cops, I said. They're coming back tomorrow. Carson didn't ask any more questions. We'll be ready. I hung up, staring at my phone for a long moment. This wasn't just intimidation. It was a war, and I was ready to fight. That night, I didn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every rustle wind outside put me on edge. My mind replayed the conversation over and over, the smug confidence in their voices, the way they loomed in my doorway, the way they spoke like they already owned my home. These men weren't con artists working out of some back office. They were professionals, and they weren't used to hearing no. By 3 a.m., I had a plan. If they were coming back, I wasn't just going to wait for them. I was going to be ready. I spent the early hours reinforcing my security cameras, setting up new angles they wouldn't see. My house already had a solid perimeter, but I took extra precautions, repositioning motion sensors and installing a second layer of hidden cameras in the tree line. The next thing I did was check my weapons. My shotgun was loaded, my sidearm cleaned and within reach, but this wasn't going to be a gunfight, at least not if I could help it. No, I needed to trap them in their own game. At sunrise, Carson and his team arrived, all dressed in tactical gear, faces hard with focus. Carson was a mountain of a man, built like a linebacker but quiet, calculated. He had been with me for years, running private security for my business ventures. I trusted him more than anyone. Intel? He asked as he stepped onto the porch, his eyes scanning the property. I handed him the forged HOA document. They're faking jurisdiction, using legal intimidation to force people off their property. But it's more than that. He scanned the paper, his frown deepening. This is organized, not some fly-by-night scam. I nodded. They've got muscle, funding, and a system. This isn't their first time. Carson folded the document and tucked it into his vest. What's the play? I exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the morning air settle around me. They'll be here soon. We don't engage first. We let them make the mistake. Carson's expression didn't change, but I saw the flicker of approval in his eyes. Roger that. My men are in position. I glanced toward the tree line. I knew they were out there, unseen but ready. Carson's team wasn't just security. They were ex-military, trained for this exact kind of pressure. If the HOA thugs wanted to fight, they were about to walk into something they didn't understand. And then, like clockwork, it happened. A black SUV and a white cargo van rolled up to the curb. Silent, methodical. The SUV parked at an angle, partially blocking my driveway. A power move. The van stopped behind it, cutting off my exit. Deliberate, controlled. These men were professionals. I watched from the porch as 4 more men climbed out, all dressed in black tactical vests with HOA stitched across the chest in stark white lettering. They weren't volunteers. They weren't neighborhood watchdogs. They were enforcers. Buzzcut was the first up the walkway, his mirrored sunglasses catching the morning sun. Behind him, dark hair followed, his usual smirk widening as he adjusted the cuffs of his vest. The other 4 men spread out, positioning themselves like a tactical unit preparing to breach a building. One casually rested a hand near his belt, not on a gun, but close enough to let me know it wouldn't take much. A fist pounded against the door. Hard, loud, demanding. I took a slow breath, steadying my pulse. Showtime. I opened the door. Buzzcut stood there, expressionless. He extended a piece of paper toward me. Clock's ticking, Mr. Walker, he said coldly. Time to comply. My eyes moved from his hand to his face, then down to the paper. And if I don't... Dark hair stepped forward, pulling a folded document from his vest. He unfolded it with deliberate slowness before holding it up between 2 fingers. We've filed an eviction order with the county, he said, grinning. You've got 5 minutes to leave the premises. I stared at the paper. I could already tell it was fake, just like the first one. But this time, they weren't playing around. My gaze flicked past them toward their men in the driveway. One cracked his neck. Another flexed his fingers near his belt. They wanted me to fold. They wanted me to break. I smiled. Make me? Buzzcut's jaw tightened. His hand drifted toward his waist, toward the black holster strapped to his side. His fingers brushed the handle. And that's when I saw movement from the side of the house, from the shadows of the tree line. 4 figures stepped into view, moving in perfect sync. Black tactical gear, gloves, combat boots, suppressed rifles raised and locked into position. My security team. Carson led the charge, stepping forward like a wall of muscle and quiet authority. His dark eyes narrowed, his stance unshaken. Behind him, his men fanned out in formation, rifles aimed but steady, not threatening, just ready. Drop it, Carson growled. Buzzcut froze. His hand hovered over his holster, his sunglasses reflecting the glint of Carson's rifle. The smirk on dark hair's face vanished in an instant. He took a small step back, but his hands remained open at his sides. The other enforcers shifted uneasily, their eyes darting between my men and Buzzcut. Scanning for an escape, I took a step forward, keeping my voice calm but firm. You think you can strong-arm me? I let the words hang between us. You think you can steal from me? Buzzcut's mouth twisted into a thin line. You don't know who you're messing with. I smiled, my voice dropping to a quiet edge. Neither do you. Carson didn't move. His rifle remained steady, his voice calm and commanding. Hands where I can see them. Now! Buzzcut's jaw flexed. He lifted his hands, slow, deliberate, away from his holster. Dark hair's eyes narrowed, his tongue running over his teeth as he glanced toward the SUV. One of the other enforcers took a half step toward the van. Don't even think about it, Carson warned. The air was thick, buzzing with unspoken violence. I could feel it, the moment teetering on the edge of something explosive. My men weren't just private security. They were trained, disciplined, but so were Buzzcut and his crew. If someone made the wrong move, this would turn bloody. I exhaled slowly, stepping even closer to Buzzcut until I could see the tight line of his mouth beneath the mirror glasses. "You already made a mistake," I said, my voice steady. Dark Hair's fingers twitched. His eyes flicked toward the SUV again. "Don't," Carson repeated, his voice sharp. The tension stretched between us, razor thin. The enforcers were good, trained, disciplined, but they weren't stupid. They knew the odds had shifted. They were outflanked, outgunned. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Buzzcut took a slow step back. His shoulders were rigid, his posture tense, but his hands remained where Carson could see them. Dark Hair followed his lead, though his expression twisted with barely concealed rage. "You've made some powerful enemies," Buzzcut said, his voice low. I chuckled, shaking my head. "Good. That means I'm doing something right." Buzzcut's jaw clenched. He held my gaze for a long moment, then turned toward the SUV. Dark Hair lingered for just a second longer, his dark eyes flashing with something colder and more dangerous than anger. He smiled, a slow, dangerous curve of his lips. "We'll be seeing you," he said. I didn't blink, looking forward to it. Without another word, Buzzcut and Dark Hair climbed into the SUV. The other enforcers followed, sliding into the white van. Engines rumbled to life. The SUV pulled away first, the van trailing behind. Carson's men didn't lower their weapons until the vehicles disappeared down the street. Even then, Carson's eyes remained sharp, scanning the road. I exhaled slowly and turned toward him. Thanks for the quick response. Carson's gaze didn't waver from the empty street. "They'll be back." "I know." He looked at me, his expression unreadable. "Next time, they'll come harder." I nodded. "So will we." Carson's mouth tightened. He signaled to his men, and they began to disperse, weapons still in hand. I stood there for a moment, heart still pounding beneath my ribs. The sun was higher now, casting sharp shadows across the driveway. A breeze cut through the air, carrying the faint scent of smoke from Dark Hair's cigarette. They'd backed down today. But this wasn't over. The sound of sirens sliced through the morning air, sharp and rising, echoing off the houses and rolling down the street. Red and blue lights flickered through the windows, strobing against the walls. Buzzcut's smirk disappeared. His jaw clenched as the police cruisers pulled up to the edge of my driveway. I took a step forward, lowering my voice. "You might want to leave." Dark Hair's eyes darted toward the approaching officers. His calm facade was slipping. His lips parted slightly, and I caught the faintest tremor in his breath. "This isn't over," he muttered, voice trembling beneath the surface. I smiled, cold, certain. "I think it is." The cruiser doors swung open in unison. 2 officers stepped out, their movements slow but deliberate. Standard patrol uniforms, holsters strapped to their sides, hands resting casually on their belts. One of them was tall and lean, the other stockier, but both had the same hard-eyed stare, the kind that told me they'd seen enough in their careers to recognize trouble when they walked into it. Buzzcut took a small step back, his head turned toward the SUV, movements sharp, measured, too controlled. He wasn't panicking. He was calculating. Carson saw it too. He stepped forward, boots planted firmly on the pavement, arms loose at his sides, relaxed, but only on the surface. His shoulders squared. "Not so fast," he said. Buzzcut's chin lifted slightly. His sunglasses reflected Carson's stoic face back at him. His hand twitched toward his side, the muscle memory of reaching for a holster that wasn't there. The taller officer's gaze flicked from Carson's tactical gear to Buzzcut's vest, then over to me. "Is there a problem here?" I stepped forward, holding out the clipboard Buzzcut had tried to force me to sign. "These men are attempting to enforce a fraudulent HOA agreement. I'd like to press charges." The officer took the clipboard and glanced down at it, his eyes narrowing. "Fraud." Buzzcut's mouth opened. "This is a misunderstanding." "No," I cut in sharply. "It's extortion. Buzzcut's mouth clamped shut. His shoulders tightened, the tension rolling through his body like a storm barely held back. He knew exactly how bad this was about to get. The stocky officer circled toward Darkhair. "Sir," hand where I can see them. Darkhair's gaze flicked toward the SUV, calculating. His lips curled upward, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. He lifted his hands, slowly. "No need for this to get ugly," he said. Carson's voice was ice. That ship already sailed. The taller officer's hand drifted toward his belt. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step away from the vehicle." Buzzcut's mouth twisted. His gaze slid toward Carson. "This is a mistake." Carson didn't blink. "No, your mistake was thinking you could walk away from this." Buzzcut inhaled slowly through his nose, posture rigid. His mind was working, scanning for options. He was the type that didn't like to lose. "You really think this isn't a stick?" Buzzcut's tone was low and cutting. "You don't know who you're dealing with." I tilted my head slightly. "I don't care." Darkhair's smile faded. His jaw flexed. "You've made a serious mistake." I exhaled, unshaken. "I'm not the one in handcuffs." The taller officer was already behind Darkhair, reaching for his wrist. The handcuffs clicked into place with a sharp metallic snap. Buzzcut's face paled beneath his mirrored glasses as the stocky officer stepped behind him, pulling his arms back and locking the cuffs into place. His mouth was tight, his expression blank, but his eyes burned. "You know how long we've been doing this?" Buzzcut's voice was quiet. "Dangerous." I stared him down. "And now it's over." Darkhair inhaled through his nose, steadying himself. His head turned toward me, his pupils dark and predatory. "You have no idea what you started." I smiled. "See you in court." The officers turned them both toward the police cars. Buzzcut didn't struggle, but the way he held his head, stiff, controlled, told me that this wasn't over for him. His pride had taken a hit. He wasn't going to forget that. Darkhair resisted just enough to make the officer tighten his grip before shoving him into the back seat. He twisted toward the window as the door slammed shut. His dark eyes locked onto mine through the glass. The stocky officer approached me, clipboard still in hand. "We're going to need a statement." "Happy to give it," I said. The taller officer leaned toward Carson. "These guys with you?" Carson's gaze remained locked on Buzzcut through the tinted glass. "Yes." "Private security?" "Yes." The officer's eyes narrowed. Did it need to go this far? Carson's mouth curled into something resembling a smile. "Yes." The officer studied him for a moment before nodding. "We'll take it from here." Carson stepped back, but his stance remained firm. His eyes tracked the cruisers as they reversed out of the driveway. Buzzcut sat rigidly in the back seat, his gaze forward. Darkhair was turned toward me. His dark eyes still burned with quiet rage. The cruisers pulled away. The sirens were off now, but the red and blue lights flashed against the houses as they disappeared down the street. I let out a slow breath. My pulse was still hammering in my ears. My hands were steady, but the tension coiled tight beneath the surface. Carson stepped beside me. "They'll be back." "I know." "They're to come back harder." I nodded. My voice was steady now. "Cold. Let them." Carson's gaze remained hard. Then he gave a short nod and walked toward the side of the house, disappearing from view. I stood there for a long moment, letting the quiet settle around me. The sun was high now, casting sharp shadows across the pavement. The street was empty, but the way it would have just happened lingered in the air like smoke. This wasn't over. Buzzcut and Darkhair weren't finished. They'd regroup. They'd push harder. Next time, they wouldn't bother with intimidation. They'd go straight for the throat. I smiled. That was fine. I was ready for them. The days that followed were anything but quiet. Word spread fast about what had happened. How 2 armed thugs posing as HOA enforcers had been arrested in my driveway, how they tried to bully me into signing away my rights, and how they had failed. But I knew better than to think this was over. People like them didn't just disappear. I spent the next few nights digging deeper, sifting through documents, tracking down records. I called my lawyer and told him to start pulling every legal filing related to that fake HOA. What we found was worse than I had imagined. This wasn't just some low-level scam. It was organized crime, wrapped in a thin layer of legal legitimacy. A newly formed HOA would suddenly claim authority over a neighborhood, filing contracts and compliance orders with the county. Once those contracts were in place, they sent in enforcers, asterisk guys like Buzzcut and Darkhair, asterisk to intimidate homeowners into signing. If that didn't work, they escalated. Fines turned into liens. Liens turned into eviction notices. And once the homeowner was forced out, the property was flipped and sold for profit. The deeper I dug, the clearer the pattern became. This had been happening across the state for over 2 years. The victims? Wealthy neighborhoods, isolated properties, places where homeowners didn't have easy access to legal support. And the worst part? Most of them never fought back. I scrolled through online forums and local news archives, looking for similar cases. They were everywhere. Stories of aggressive HOA enforcement teams demanding outrageous fees, issuing fake violation notices, and forcing people out of their homes. And behind it all, the same law firm. A single firm based out of Sacramento had handled the legal paperwork for over a dozen of these fraudulent HOAs. They had a reputation for shady real estate acquisitions, aggressive foreclosure tactics, and using legal loopholes to pressure homeowners into compliance. But the real bombshell came when I traced the financial records. The fraudulent HOA fees, the fines, the compliance penalties, all of it funneled into offshore accounts. The money was being laundered through a series of holding companies registered in the Cayman Islands. And those holding companies, they were owned by the senior partners at the Sacramento law firm. This wasn't just fraud. It was racketeering. Buzzcut and Darkhair weren't just hired muscle. They were part of the operation. They'd been on the payroll for years, running the same intimidation tactics from one neighborhood to the next. And they weren't alone. There were other enforcers, other scams, other victims. My hands curled into fists as I sat back in my chair, staring at the laptop screen. This wasn't about my house anymore. It was bigger than that. I picked up my phone and dialed Carson. "What do you need?" he asked, his voice steady. I exhaled, my jaw tightening. "Backup." "When?" "Tonight." There was a brief pause. Then Carson spoke, his tone firm. "Understood." I ended the call and closed the laptop. They had come to my doorstep thinking I was just another homeowner they could bully into submission. They were wrong. That night, my property wasn't just a home. It was a battlefield. Carson and his team arrived just after sundown, pulling up in unmarked vehicles, their gear locked and loaded. They moved in silence, spreading out across the property, taking positions in the shadows. Night vision scopes, suppressed rifles, tactical comms. This wasn't just a precaution. We were preparing for war. Carson crouched beside me on the porch, scanning the driveway through a pair of binoculars. "They'll come back," he said. "They always do." I nodded. "Let's make sure they regret it." We didn't have to wait long. At exactly midnight, headlights appeared at the end of the street. 2 black SUVs. No markings. No plates. Their engines rumbled low, creeping toward my house like predators in the dark. I watched as they rolled to a stop in the driveway, the smell of burning rubber lingering in the cold night air. 4 men stepped out. Buzzcut and Darkhair were back, but this time they weren't alone. They brought reinforcements. 2 more enforcers, dressed in the same black tactical vests, hands resting near their holsters. They thought they were in control. They had no idea they were walking straight into a trap. Buzzcut was the first to speak. "Last chance, Davis," he called out, his voice sharp, confident. "Sign the contract, or we take this to the next level." I leaned against the porch railing, arms crossed, my expression unreadable. "Go ahead," I said. "Take it to the next level." For a split second, Buzzcut hesitated. He hadn't expected that. Then Darkhair chuckled, shaking his head. "You're making a mistake," he said, stepping forward. "You really don't want to push us." I smiled coldly. "You think I'm scared of you?" Darkhair's smirk faltered. Then, in an instant, everything changed. A red laser that appeared on his chest. Buzzcut's eyes widened as he followed the glowing mark, realizing too late what was happening. One by one, red dots flickered to life, painting his men like targets in the night. Carson's voice crackled through my earpiece. We have visual. All targets locked. Buzzcut's fingers twitched toward his holster. Don't. The voice came from the dark. Carson stepped into the open, his rifle aimed, his stance unwavering. Behind him, his men emerged from the shadows. 8 armed operators, all locked onto the intruders. Buzzcut's jaw clenched. What the hell is this? I stepped forward, my voice calm but firm. This is me not playing your game anymore. For the first time, dark hair looked nervous. You don't know who you're dealing with, Buzzcut growled. I took another step, lowering my voice to a deadly whisper. Neither do you. Silence stretched between us, thick with tension. Then, in the distance, sirens. Buzzcut stiffened. His men shifted, eyes darting toward the street, toward the flashing blue and red lights growing brighter by the second. The police were coming. Dark hair took a step back. We need to leave, he muttered. Buzzcut hesitated, rage flickering in his eyes. But he knew they had lost. This isn't over, he spat. I smiled. Oh, it is. The lead police cruiser skidded to a stop at the edge of the driveway. Officers pouring out, weapons drawn. Carson and his men didn't move, their rifles still trained on the intruders. Hands where we can see them, an officer barked. For a moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, Buzzcut lifted his hands. One by one, they surrendered. Handcuffs snapped shut. Weapons were confiscated. Officers read them their rights as they were shoved into the back of the cruisers. Buzzcut sat rigid in the seat, his jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might crack. Dark hair, on the other hand, smirked at me through the window, shaking his head. Even in defeat, he was planning something. I watched as they were driven away, the red and blue lights flickering against the night sky. Carson exhaled beside me, lowering his rifle. That went well. I smirked. Yeah, let's see how well it goes in court. Because this wasn't just about sending them to jail. This was about burning their entire operation to the ground. And I wasn't done yet. The arrests were only the beginning. The real fight was just getting started. The next morning, my lawyer and I sat in his office, documents spread across a mahogany table like pieces of a puzzle. Bank statements, property records, emails. It was all there, proof that this wasn't just some 2-bit scam. It was an empire built on fraud, intimidation, and stolen homes. My lawyer, James Holloway, leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin. This is bigger than I thought, he admitted. These guys weren't just running a fake HOA. They were running a full-scale land-grabbing racket. I tapped the thickest file on the table, the one labeled Sacramento Real Estate Holdings. And I'm guessing their backers are bigger than just Buzzcut and dark hair. James nodded. Their law firm in Sacramento, Morgan & Pierce. They've been behind over a dozen fraudulent HOAs across the state. He flipped open another folder, revealing a spreadsheet. Same playbook. Fake contracts, legal intimidation. And when that doesn't work, they send enforcers. I clenched my jaw. So this wasn't just about me. James exhaled. Not even close. I had suspected from the start, but seeing it laid out in black and white made my blood boil. They had ruined lives, families, homes. Some people had been bled dry with fines. Others had been forced out, their properties seized, flipped, and sold to the highest bidder. But here was the thing about paper trails. They lead somewhere, and now we had enough evidence to burn them to the ground. James picked up his phone. I'll call the district attorney. With what we have, they'll open a full-scale investigation. I didn't just want an investigation. I wanted them destroyed. I wasn't the only one. By the end of the week, the story had exploded. News stations ran segments about the HOA scam that stole millions. Journalists dug deep, pulling up interviews with victims, showcasing families who've been threatened, harassed, and forced from their homes. The more people came forward, the uglier the truth became. They told me my house wasn't mine anymore. A single mother sobbed on camera that I had to pay or get out. They drained my parents' savings with fines. An elderly man said, voice shaking with rage, we nearly lost everything. And then the real bombshell hit. A whistleblower, a former employee of Morgan and Pierce, came forward. He gave an interview, his face blurred, voice distorted. It was all planned, he revealed. We created fake HOAs, set up dummy shell companies, and filed just enough legal paperwork to make it seem legitimate. But the real money? That came from forcing people out. The interviewer leaned in. And what happened when people fought back? The whistleblower hesitated. Then he said coldly, they sent in the enforcers. With mounting public pressure, law enforcement had no choice. The FBI got involved. Subpoenas were issued. Bank accounts were frozen. The partners at Morgan and Pierce were indicted for racketeering, fraud, and conspiracy. And then came the final nail in the coffin, the civil lawsuits. Hundreds of homeowners, including me, filed against them. The courts ruled the contracts fraudulent and unenforceable. Fines were reversed. Restitution was ordered. In total, they owed nearly $50 million. Their empire collapsed overnight. And Buzzcut and Dark Hair, they weren't just looking at 20 years anymore. They were looking at life. I sat on my porch the night the verdict was announced, a cold beer in hand, watching the sunset paint the sky in gold and crimson. Carson pulled up in his SUV, stepping out with his usual stoic expression. It's over, he said. I took a slow sip. Yeah, it is. Carson smirked. You don't sound convinced. I exhaled, setting the bottle down. Guys like that don't just disappear. He studied me for a moment before nodding. Maybe not, but if they ever show up again. I grinned. We'll be ready. The battle had been won. But the war? That was something else entirely. Even with the fraudulent HOAs dismantled, the law firm in ruins, and Buzzcut and Dark Hair rotting in a cell, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the last I'd hear of them. Maybe it was the way Dark Hair smirked at me from the back of the police cruiser. Maybe it was the stories I had uncovered. Families who had vanished. People who had pushed back and never been heard from again. I had played my part in bringing them down. But in the shadows, I knew there were still others. Others who profited from scams like these. Others who weren't in handcuffs yet. And people like that, they don't forget. A month after the trial, a letter arrived at my doorstep. No return address. No markings. Just a thick envelope. Heavier than it should have been. I opened it slowly. My gut already telling me it wasn't good. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No threats. No demands. Just 6 words. This isn't over. We never forget. Beneath it, a photo, a grainy black and white surveillance image of me, taken from across the street. Last night, I sat there for a long time, the letter in one hand, the photo in the other. I wasn't scared. I was angry because I knew what this meant. They were watching. Not just me, my neighborhood, my people, my home. I picked up my phone and dialed Carson. He answered on the first ring. Talk to me. I need you to put the team on permanent standby. A pause. Then understood. I hung up and walked to the front porch. The sun was setting again, casting long shadows across the street. My neighbors were outside, laughing, playing, living their lives, unaware that something was still lurking out there. I folded the letter, placed it back in the envelope, and tossed it into the fire pit. I watched the flames consume it, the words, "This isn't over," curling into smoke and ash. Maybe it wasn't over. Maybe they'd come back. But if they did, I'd be waiting.